It goes largely without saying that media is a reflection of the ways of thinking present at a moment of time. If one were to look back to the turn of the 20th century, and even the 21st, they would see a world largely dominated by those who didn't seem to care nor understand the struggles of people that weren't them. In examining the change in media over time, we're able to better understand the small steps that have led to greater changes within our society. In Robert Zeglin's essay, Portrayal of Masculinity in Guy Movies, Exploring Viewer Character Dissonance, he discusses at length the fact that mainstream Hollywood films are a reflection and reinforcement of both positive and negative masculine traits, which exist as a result of social constructionism. We can define social constructionism as a theory that knowledge and many aspects of the world around us are not real in of themselves. They only exist because we give them reality through social agreement. For Zeglin, he uses social constructionism to argue that the idea of the masculine within these Guy movies is a projection of the socially constructed idea of that masculinity within our society, with these films playing their own part in socially reinforcing these positive and negative traits to the predominantly male audience. Via Mulvey, Zeglin notes that this identification process is predicated on the psychoanalytic pleasure derived by the viewer through the satiation of their scopophilic desires. That is, the viewer unconsciously demands identification of the ego with the object on the screen through the spectator's fascination with and recognition of his like. In short, much like we discussed earlier, these characters in films are a reflection of the way in which these men think and act. Zeglin utilizes the Conformity to Masculine Norms Inventory, or CMNI, as first introduced by Mahalik, to compare the male protagonists of Braveheart, The Departed, and The French Connection to understand the prevalence of these CMNI factors in both mainstream film and their viewers. These 11 factors are labelled as winning, emotional control, risk-taking, violence, dominance, playboy, self-reliance, primacy of work, power over women, and disdain for homosexuals. Zeglin makes the point that social constructionism suggests that the defining characteristics of masculinity are socially ascribed, and that social constructionism asserts that what is considered masculine by society is dynamic and can evolve. This fits perfectly in line with much academic opinion on social construction of the self, where our identity is created by interactions with other people and our reactions to the expectations of society. While Zeglin does examine each of these films in isolation, he doesn't go too far into the actual construction and development of these ideas of the masculine over time. Within this video, I hope to do just that. In contrasting two versions of the same character, almost half a century apart, I will demonstrate via the CMNI index the changes to the idea of the masculine that have taken place over that time. And what better character to do it with than only the manliest of men?
Bond. James Bond.
With Sean Connery's Bond in 1964's Goldfinger and Daniel Craig's Bond in 2012's Skyfall. Given that I only have a small amount of time to do so, I'll be selecting what I believe to be the CMNI factors that have undergone the most change over that period between the two films. I'm aware that this does impart some bias, as I will be the one doing the selecting, but I'm sure that you understand. For me, and I'm sure you too, these factors are power over women and emotional control. While Connery's Bond is a gun-toting killer with little else but women and cheap thrills on his mind, Craig as Bond is a very complex individual with a deep history shrouded in mystery. While within Skyfall we still don't get too much information on the matter, adding to the mystery of his character and the series as a whole, we're given small clues as to what made him who he is. A dark past, a loss of childhood innocence, and a need to save the woman who essentially mothered him. Are these brooding thoughts something that we would have attributed to masculinity in the 60s? God no. Connery doesn't make mention of the way he feels once throughout the entirety of Goldfinger, unless it's some innuendo alluding to feeling a need to seduce one of his many female co-stars.
First, I have some unfinished business to attend to.
While it's hard to compare the emotional control of these two characters when one of them doesn't seem to demonstrate any emotion whatsoever, the introduction of these feelings to a traditionally masculine figure demonstrates a change in the idea of this masculinity amongst the audience. While in the past it was the case that men didn't tend to talk about their feelings, we live in an age where emotional understanding is pretty much at the centre of being a normal human being. The fact that Bond's emotionally distressed past is at the centre of the entire film makes the point that these emotions are of a huge concern to the male audience and the general population as a whole. We see this within our society daily, even just recently with the release of the ABC's television show Man Up, that men are now opening themselves up to their emotions. In the media, a version of presumably sensitive New Age masculinity emerged. This new man offered an alternative to traditional representations of masculinity, albeit without straying too far from dominant conceptions of manhood. Social constructionism in action. The gap between the two films has not only seen a huge change to the concept of Western masculinity, but also to the standing of the entirety of the female population. The general attitude towards women is perhaps the most obvious difference between the two Bonds in these films, and demonstrates an expectation of respect as part of a masculinity. Skyfall is filled to the brim with female characters who all seem to have some level of control over Bond. Whether it's sexual, emotional, or professional, these women are all the embodiments of relationships that men and women have with one another in our present day. While some of these characters and lines of dialogue could still seem backward and potentially sexist, the difference between Skyfall and Goldfinger highlights the male population's changing view of the opposite sex. Connery's Bond seems to have little regard for any female character throughout the entirety of the film, however, unless he plans to have sex with them.
Dink, say goodbye to Felix. Man talk.
And the juxtaposition of shots and use of music doesn't help to aid the position of these women at all either. This difference is perhaps the biggest case for films and media as a reflection of social constructionism. Within film theory, Benshoff and Griffin make clear that representations of men and masculinity are as socially constructed as are those of women, and need to be explored in a similar manner. Much like masculinity is ever-changing and evolving over time, so too is femininity, or the idea of being a woman in general. As women have increasingly been able to share their opinion and generally be in a more individual position within our society, social constructionism has slowly taught the men of the world that a respect for women is deeply ingrained within their own identities, and meant a real-world change in the way that people of all genders interact with each other. While guy movies still regularly come under fire for their portrayal of female characters and unrealistic male role models, it's important to recognise different pieces of media in demonstrating an arc of social development and change. In observing the diverse array of masculine images presented by the media and factoring in the changes that have occurred over the previous two generations, one would think that the pressures to conform to traditional notions of aggressive maleness would have severely dissipated by the growing acceptance of other behaviours. Where will James Bond's character be in another 50 years? Only time will tell.